Welcome everyone back to another episode of Voices of the Motherland. You're here with Sahil and Ananya. We're both two third-year students studying at the University of St. Andrews, talking about everything South Asia, culture, identity, and politics.
For this episode, we'd like to welcome Dr. Rosalind Parr, who is a researcher and lecturer at the School of Modern History at the university. Thank you, Dr. Parr, for joining us, and we're
Thank
really
you so
excited
much.
to talk.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on.
So, for the first question, maybe we thought we could start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I was born in Yorkshire and I'm from a small village just outside Leeds. And I was always going to be born in Yorkshire because my father was a really big cricket fan. And in those days, they didn't know, well, they hadn't found out what sex I was. So there was always a chance that I might play for Yorkshire cricket, you see. But as it turned out, I was born in Yorkshire, but was a girl and therefore didn't play cricket for Yorkshire ever. And in fact, neither did my brother, who was born 2 years later. But, you know, Yorkshire, my family is from Yorkshire, but for me growing up, you know, it was a very sort of nice place to grow up, but I was very keen to break out as soon as I could. So I haven't lived in Yorkshire since I was 18 and went to university. I've lived various places, but now I'm in Edinburgh. So I live in Edinburgh with my family, my husband, my two daughters. We've got a big black cat and an even bigger black dog, who is a recent arrival. He's a lockdown puppy. So yeah, all fun and games here.
Wow, that's a massive family. But I was wondering what got you interested in pursuing a career in academia?
Okay, so I think as soon as my cricket career pretensions were over, since that wasn't probably ever going to happen, I think I was always interested in doing something cultural. And I think, you know, I've always been interested in books and learning, and some of the best sort of times of my life, not to sound too geeky, have been sitting reading books in libraries and being in archives. So I've always loved that. But actually, I didn't initially pursue a career in academia. So although I really enjoyed my studies at university, after university, I spent some time working in television and advertising in London. So I had a sort of a pre-career in sort of media, in the sort of media creative industries, before I came back to academia.
Is that quite common to have like kind of a career before going into academia, or is it most academics they kind of just go straight in and they know?
Yeah, it's not very common, and I wouldn't necessarily advise it if you want to progress your career path, because academia is so demanding and so competitive that, you know, you want to kind of give yourself as good a sort of head start as you can. But on the other hand, I think, you know, it's been extremely in a sort of personal terms of personal development, it's been an excellent choice. You know, I learned a lot, and I'm still really interested in a lot of those things. So I'm interested in filmmaking, and, you know, perhaps, you know, these will be things that I will bring into my academic work, my research at some point. You know, I haven't sort of closed off that period of my life. So I'm hoping, you know, it's all about, I'm interested in telling stories, and I'm interested in telling stories about the past. And I think my background in sort of media actually is completely compatible with what I do in academia.
And so how did you transition from going from media, working in advertising towards academia?
That was quite a sharp break. So it was around the time that I had my first child, actually. So I just stopped working for a while, for a couple of years, and went back to university, did a master's, did a PhD, and then I was on the academic track.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, and like you said, very individual to you. I was wondering so you specialize in South Asian history, and I was wondering how that came to be, and how you became interested in that.
Well, that goes back to my undergraduate days. So as a student, I think I was really looking to break out of sort of more traditional and the sort traditional histories and the sort of histories that I'd done at school. There was a lot of British and European history on offer, but I really wanted to expand my horizons. So I was interested in doing all sorts of any non-European history essentially, but South Asia was the one that really sort of gripped me, I suppose, and that was the route I ended up going down.
And now let's transition a bit more into your research specifically. Could you tell us a bit about your research focus and the sort of literature you created in your time in academia?
Yes, so I am interested, well, the majority of my research so far has been on women in the Indian nationalist movement. So looking at their role in the 1920s and the 1930s, all the women that I have researched have been quite closely connected to the mainstream nationalist movement, so Gandhi and Nehru and others. And so often they've been cast in this quite supportive, in this role, as supportive actors in, this sort of drama of Indian nationalism. And when I started researching them, then I realized that actually, they had these, sort of independent lives, independent careers, and that's what I've been looking at. And one of the things that I've been researching is their transnational, international careers. So the women that I look at were very engaged in international networks. They were internationally connected with women's movements and other sort of civil society movements internationally in the 1920s and 30s. They were interested in connecting to, let's say, the League of Nations to try and sort of promote their interests there. And later they were very involved at the United Nations, and the United Nations came into being. So that has been the main focus of my research so far. I'm now kind of branching out and looking at sort of various different aspects of women's transnational connectedness, looking at sort of anti-colonial solidarities, and also sort of more what you would call third world solidarity, so after independence, looking at that. I'm also still very interested in this kind of world government arena. So, and one of the things I've been getting really interested in recently, for probably obvious reasons, is the history of global health. My time frame and the women that I've been interested in the past have been were very interested in organizations like the World Health Organization, and were actually quite prominent at the beginning of the history of the World Health Organization. So I'm thinking now about issues connected to gender and global health in this period, sort of in the 1930s, from the 1930s, but 1950s, 1960s, that kind of period.
So you've kind of already touched upon this, but I wanted to ask you about how, like you said, in the national movement within South Asia, within India, it's dominated by people who we call freedom fighters, and then they tend to be mostly male figures, and very few women are acknowledged or even discussed, and mostly as just supplementary to your reading or your study, and sometimes not even that. I was wondering why you think that is, but also more if you could highlight the role women played both on a mass scale, but also in terms of top leadership in the national movement, maybe briefly.
Okay, sure. So I think there's various reasons for why women have been sidelined in history. it's all quite complex. This is obviously something that is across the board in history. Women have been generally more erased, and of course, in the past, then they were in various ways, then they were marginalized anyway. So when we're looking at the mainstream histories, then of course, you end up kind of focusing on the sort of the mainstream leaders. So that's one reason. But the other reason is, I think in nationalism, Indian nationalism, then the history of the sort of mythology of nationalism has focused on this mainstream story, and that's often the way with histories. Women's roles were more complex, and not necessarily always feeding into this narrative of freedom, as in terms of anti-colonial freedom. So they were also interested in the rights of women, for example. So that's a sort of a complicating story, which detracts from the sort of mainstream narrative. So many of our narratives are these kind of binary narratives, imperialism versus nationalism. So this kind of story of women's rights sort of cuts across that. And it's also quite complex, because although Indian nationalism and Indian nationalist figures supported women's emancipation, as they called it, then actually there was this sense that, okay, that's something that we can sort out after independence. That will come with independence. Whereas actually women activists were working for that before independence. So they were sort of working on sort of women's rights. And that's a sort of, I suppose, a complicating story when you're thinking about the history of imperialism versus nationalism. So it is a sort of, it's I suppose, a more marginal history, and that's why I think it gets erased. So in terms of the role that women did play, so women were involved with nationalist demonstrations and nationalist activism across the board. So Gandhi is often credited with this role of encouraging the participation of women. And in fact, he did. That's something that he specifically did. He encouraged women to come out and play specific roles in nationalist agitations. But these were very gendered. So as far as Gandhi was concerned, women had a sort of, there was a proper role for women within the nationalist movement. So that would be picketing cloth shops or picketing liquor shops, because these were, picketing was a peaceful and organised activity, so therefore respectable. It could also be, if it was women only, then it was segregated along the lines of sex. So they didn't have the danger of irrespectability. So that was another thing. And also, this has been called the domestication of the private sphere. So these issues, like cloth and liquor, they could be connected to women's proper role within the family, as, for example, women were interested in the buying of cloth, for example. So this could be a woman's issue. So it was a gendered form of activism. So that was one role, but actually consistently women kind of pushed the boundaries of these prescriptions. For example, in the 1930s, during the salt satyagraha, then women were not originally supposed to be involved in the harvesting of salt, for example. That was supposed to be a man's fight. That was a sort of masculine activity, but women did do it anyway. So that was one way they transgressed these boundaries. But also, for all Gandhi's role in encouraging women, then actually women took on a lot of roles upon their own initiative, especially women in sort of subaltern movements, for example, revolutionary women. That women were involved in lots of activities that sort of opposed British rule, but not necessarily in the way that Gandhi prescribed. So that was a sort of mass level agitation level. But women were also involved at a leadership level. So they would lead women's groups, for example. One very famous woman, Sarojini Naidu, she was actually the president of the Indian National Congress. She was sponsored by Gandhi, but she was the president of the Indian National Congress in 1925. So they did play this role. There were other women that were also quite prominent within the movement. They also played a very important role in promoting nationalism abroad. So this is one of the things that I look at in my research. So because one of the claims of imperial rule was that it exerted this kind of modernizing, civilizing role, then actually part of the nationalist claim was actually, no, Indian women are already modern, already emancipated, but just in a different way to the way that the British would have it. So women like Sarojini Naidu performed this role as as representatives of a sort of Indian women's emancipation.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And I categorically remember growing up, because I did study in India. Like I remember my textbook having like just a supplementary passage on women's roles, and it just being along the lines of supporting and how Gandhi encouraged them. But I also remember like wanting to study more about women, so doing this entire project on Sarojini Naidu. So I guess even in the education sphere within India, it's there, but it's like very minimal, and we don't go into nuances, which is changing, I think, specifically in higher education, and because people are starting to get more self-aware and wanting to do this. But I think within the established education system, it still doesn't exist, and I don't see it changing considering the current political climate. But on another note, I was also thinking about, so you've spoken previously about anti-colonial feminism and looking at the transnational histories of women. And I was wondering, how narratives like this, like Indian women going to Geneva to protest, have been erased and not included in mainstream gender studies also per se. And with the past year and before that, there's been a lot of conversation about intersectional feminism. So why do you think that's so important to keep in mind? And do you think that is changing now? Like, do you think the stories of women from different parts of the world are being included in, let's say, mainstream gender studies?
Yes, I mean, I think this is an extremely important issue and something that really does drive my research. But it's not new. Intersectional feminism has been something that's been really big in academia and also in feminist circles since the 1980s and the 1990s. It's not new, but it's one of these things that quite often gets sidelined, especially in our mainstream narratives. But yes, it is extremely important. And one of the reasons is that there is sometimes a cultural arrogance associated with feminism. It's there in the roots of feminism. And I think, in many ways, this has been, as I said, it's been addressed for, decades and decades and decades now. But I think it's important for us to keep reminding ourselves about the imperial roots of international feminism, for example. So international feminists in the 1920s and earlier were part of the imperial project. And this is something that we see with British feminists in India. So women in Britain got the vote, or some of them in 1918, and then all of them in 1928. And this kind of role that women had now within the imperialist establishment was gendered. So for many feminists, they had to sort of justify this kind of new citizenship role by performing a particular role within the empire, and that was gendered. So women feminists saw themselves as, you know, the spokespeople for Indian women, and it took people like Indian feminists challenging that to undermine this kind of imperialist claim of British feminists that, you know, they were speaking for Indian women on the world stage and within the sort of British imperial establishment as well. So when there were debates going on about suffrage for women in India, then when we're looking at the 1930s, for example, there were women's organisations in Britain who claimed to speak on behalf of Indian women. Now, by this point, India had quite a sort of a well-developed women's movement who were themselves wanting to speak on behalf of Indian women. So there was quite a clash between the British feminists who claimed to speak on behalf of their Indian sisters and Indian women's leaders who were wanting to speak on behalf of Indian women themselves. So, you know, it's important to acknowledge that and to keep reminding ourselves that, you know, this category of woman, which is, you know, the sort of main founding category for feminism, it is itself, you know, a very heterogeneous category. And we need to look at the sort of power relations within that. So whether it's in the past, sort of imperialism, or whether it's race, class, sexuality, you know, all of these kind of axes that intersect the category of woman is really important for us to remember. You know, as feminists, you know, we need to remember that, you know, the category of woman is a very heterogeneous category.
And within a lot of conventional narratives, as well as like historical narratives, India, the view of India is there's kind of two views of what India is. One being like a liberal home of different like of ideas and ideas of race and sex, like with the Kama Sutra. But then there's also a conservative aspect to that, and that's sometimes there's an association with that, with a conservative India being linked to the British rule and how they influence conservative aspects of race, of sex, of religion. And I was wondering what your thoughts upon this idea was, whether these two perceptions exist and to what extent.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And I think it's, you know, the past is a complex place, okay? Just like the present is a complex place. So I think it's important not to idealize the past, or I suppose to try to oversimplify what the past is. I think that these two sort of poles that you describe, I think they're definitely there. But I think that, you know, the research, sort of academic research is probably a bit more nuanced than that. And what we're interested in historians is seeing how these ideas and how these kind of different structures develop over time. And you mentioned, the role of colonialism in the sort of development of ideas about gender and sexuality in the past. And I think, you know, for me as a sort of a historian of the modern era, that's what I'm interested in, how these ideas develop and shift over time, and, you know, how obviously they're complex. We have sort of hegemonic structures, but then we have other ideas and experiences that sort of challenge those hegemonic structures. But I do think the role of colonialism in developing ideas about gender and sexuality is, really important for us to understand. And again, going back to this idea of the civilizing mission of imperialism, let's look. So, of course, the imperial rule was based on this idea of civilizing India, and that's rested on this idea, or partly on this idea, of the role of the status of women within Indian society. So, there is this claim, this sort of imperial justification, that because of the supposedly degraded role of status of women in society, then that justified colonial rule. So it is important for us to understand that imperial rule was itself, or the imperial context was also a patriarchal society. And when these two competing patriarchal systems met, then that produced new patriarchies, or an adjusted and amended sort of a new colonial patriarchy that sort of had its own kind of nature and character. But it's interesting to see how that developed over time, and in certain contexts within sort of the imperial period.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think in class we always see this like the liberal like colonial order and how colonial officials had brought reforms such as like the end of sati or the ending of child marriages in India, and that being a liberal justification for colonial rule. And it was really interesting how you brought that aspect up, because within literature you see, within like at least that the colonial literature, it's quite common. And I was wondering if acts of social welfare was quite common as like justifications for colonial rule.
Yeah, so the sati example is the sort of the main one that is often used, and there is a historian called Lata Mani who's written extensively on this, and I think one of the really interesting things that she shows in her work is the way that in these debates about sati, then the women here are the object. They're almost irrelevant to these discussions. There is this idea of the sort of British imperial establishment saving these Indian women. I mean, I think the evidence is that the number of women who were committing sati was very statistically fairly small in any case. But the way that she, Lata Mani, shows the development of these debates, it's really interesting. So the ideas about, so there's various parties involved in these debates about women. So you have the imperial establishment, you have Indian Orthodox opinions, and you have Indian reformers. And all of them are actually creating sort of taking a patriarchal approach to all of this. It's all about the role of sort of women within the family, and all of them are sort of developing these ideas about sort of saving women and the role of women, how men can protect women. But you don't hear the voices of women at all there. So women's voices are erased. So even these this sort of reformist ideas are actually very sort of patriarchal.
Yeah, definitely. And I also feel like I did study like sociology when I was growing up in high school. And I remember we used to study about reform, and it was always, we tried to study it from an Indian approach. So whether it was remarriage for widows, stopping child marriage, we always used to study about like men carrying out these reformed, whether it was like this man called Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And I mean, all of the activities were very important and it was good, but it was always about, okay, this person saw his sister-in-law suffering and wanted to protect her, and that's why he reformed. So I think I haven't really thought about that perspective before, but I think it's really interesting you bring it up. We've previously touched upon this a little bit when we spoke about gender and sexuality, but India has a massive hijra community, and it becomes very specific to India. That was historically, maybe in pre colonial times, very important in the royal households and in terms of patronage. But now this community is plagued by stigma and socio-economic strife. So I know in your module on gender and sexuality in India, you do talk about the third gender. I was wondering, because in recent times, whether it's in fashion campaigns or just photography in general and writing also, the hijra community seems to be this public face of trans communities and queer liberation in India. And keeping in mind what we previously said about specific origins of feminism and even, I guess, queer theory, what do you think, if you had any opinions on this specific use of the word trans and hijra kind of interchangeably, and whether you had any thoughts on that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, labels are always, have sort of complex meanings, and they can be empowering. But anytime that you have a generalized label, then it can also erase meaning at the same time. So I think it's trying to think through these kind of the complexities of labels. Now, third gender, is not perhaps accurate, but what it does do is at least undermine this kind of binary idea about gender. Okay, so in 2014, this was kind of legally recognized in India, this kind of third gender. So, and this obviously feeds into these kind of global sort of trans debates. I mean, we're living in a globalized era, especially when it comes to issues such as this, the sort of trans rights and non-binary issues. This is a globalized issue, and India is part of is a globalized place, especially in terms of these kind of transfers of ideas and knowledge about sexuality, about gender, and so I think thinking through these terms is it's important. It depends who is using it as well. I think if it feels like a sort of an empowering term for someone within the hijra community to use, then then great. But I think, as you say, there is a danger of this sort of erasing the meaning of and the history of the hijra. So I think it's very complex, but again, this is, I think, why historians can play a role, because we're interested in thinking about how these identities and labels change over time. So I think historians have a role there. There's a very sort of rich history, very linked to like some of the things we've been talking about sort of colonial rule, so the hijra community. There was sort of very specific kind of colonial legislation associated with the hijra community. So thinking about how this has happened over time, I think is something that historians can add to the debates about these kind of labels that are in popular usage now.
It's incredibly interesting how asking you all these questions to understand like your opinion, your views, and the arguments you present in your research, because based on like your cultural background of born in Yorkshire and living in like an environment and education system that wasn't as aware of more global histories, I was wondering how that cultural background had affected your research and whether you feel like it has affected the way you view Indian history.
Yes, and I think as a historian, I think historians are trained or should be trained to recognise their own perspectives and being sort of reflective of that as you conduct your research. So I think that's kind of the number one thing for a historian, is to confront their own cultural and academic and social background. All of these things feed into the way that we see the world. One of the great things about academia, and from my point of view, from studying South Asian history, is we have access to so many different perspectives. And I think probably the number two thing to recognize is that my research, as a historian, I'm standing on the shoulders of, some very important giants who have, so by reading and engaging with these ideas over time, that has sort of, I suppose, challenged the sort of ideas and the histories that I grew up with. So I think that's probably the sort of number one, the most important thing to think about is, first of all, where your own perspectives come from, and secondly, just to sort of learn from other people with different perspectives. So I think that is hopefully something that's ongoing in my work as well. But I think it has affected the things that I'm interested in. So the work that I do is often relating to how Indian women themselves have confronted these ideas. So I suppose the fact that I have sort of some of the ideas that I grew up with have been sort of challenged by the work that I've done has made me sort of think about how that has also happened in the past. So I think it does inevitably affect your background, your own journey inevitably affects the way the questions that you ask, and the topics that you're interested in. But I think the important thing is to constantly be sort of thinking about that and reflecting on that.
Yeah, I think it is quite interesting that you bring that up. I took a module last year in art history, and I remember I always found myself drawing from examples back at home, even though it was nothing related to India. And I remember at one point I apologized to my tutor, and I was like, "I'm sorry, I keep talking about things in relation to India." And then the thing she told me was, "You should never be sorry about that, because that's recognizing where you're coming from also, because your own context is very important as a historian or as a researcher." And I found it quite interesting because we always talk about recognizing our context, but till before that, I'd not considered it in that light or in that way. And I was like constantly apologizing because I felt like other people might not be interesting. But it's just when you said that, it made me think of that, the constant need to like reevaluate and consider your context regardless of what it is. So that was quite interesting. Since we are talking about this, I thought it'd also be nice to talk a little bit about issues of representation within the curriculum and decolonization, if that's the word we want to give it. So there has been a lot of more talk, I guess, surrounding these issues in the past few years. Like you said previously, it's not new, it's nothing new within academia or for people who are working on this. But more broadly, I feel like people are now more aware of it, like in terms of a mass level, whether it's because of last year or the ongoing discussions. So I was wondering if, since your time teaching at St. Andrews or your time being first interested in South Asian history, have you noticed an increased number of opportunities or modules which look at maybe non-European, non-Western centric histories? And do you think there's a change in the interest people have in these kind of alternative histories?
Yes, I mean, I think this has definitely been happening. So since the time I was first at university in the 90s, like the amount of sort of non-European and sort of, I suppose, more critical of empire type modules, has definitely expanded. But it's still perhaps fairly marginal within academia. I think I think there's definitely an increased interest, but perhaps it could go a bit more quickly. I've noticed a lot of, or not a lot, but a few posts being advertised in Black British history, for example, in a number of universities around the UK. So I think this is happening. And I have noticed, so over time, this has been happening. But I think we're still quite underrepresented in terms of, these topics. And I think there's definitely still work to do. I think at St Andrews, I think we are definitely including more of these kind of perspectives, even in like the sort of survey courses that students do in the first and second year. We're including now sort of more kind of non-European and global perspectives in these kind of survey courses.
And it's quite common for certain modules concerning like gender or race for people who are more connected to those topics such as minorities or women to take those modules. And I was wondering whether you took note about like the demographics of people who take your course concerning like South Asian women within those movements, whether there's a broad range of people who are now becoming more interested in these topics, or whether it's still those specific groups that like have a larger connection to those topics that take those modules.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's self-selecting, isn't it? People who are you take the modules that you're already interested in, and I suppose that will always be the case. But you don't know who's going to be interested in what. Perhaps you can't, prejudge what people are interested in. But yeah, I mean, I think my module on gender and sexuality in South Asia, that's module, only had one male student in. So I think you do notice that there are probably trends and themes in the way that people choose their modules. That is probably the case.
So since you do talk about colonial India, and that's a major part of your research, I was wondering what were your thoughts on this term that is now almost, I personally feel it's become very trendy because it's used so much, this notion of decolonizing the curriculum. Again, like we said before, it's not a new concept, but what kind of significance does this term have for you? And what is the notion of decolonizing really like mean, apart from being constantly shared on social media, Twitter, Instagram? What does it mean for you personally?
I think it has various connotations, actually. I mean, I think on one level it is about expanding out our sort of frame of reference to look beyond what is traditionally for history. It's a very traditionally a Eurocentric field. So I think in one way, then decolonization is just about expanding our ideas, but also we need to kind of interrogate as well. So I think really trying to understand the role of imperialism and colonialism, this history within our sort of broader understanding of the past. And I think for me, that is really what decolonizing history, decolonizing the curriculum is about. It's about understanding the importance of imperialism and colonialism in shaping so much of our present, and that includes the university. So, but it also includes like so much of our cultural life. Our cultural life. So much of it, if you want to talk about museums, for example, so much of it rests on, the dispossession of other parts of the world. And I think for me, decolonizing history, decolonizing curriculum, decolonizing museums, it's about coming to terms with that, just understanding what that history is. I mean, it's often decolonizing the curriculum, or this term is often seen as political, and to the extent that everything is political, then it is. But for me, it's about being accurate about the past. Let's understand how our present has come about, and that's, for me, is what decolonizing the curriculum is about. Just being a bit more accurate in our understanding about the past.
And that despite there being maybe a huge drive towards decolonizing the curriculum, do you feel that there are specific aspects of it that might be harder to decolonize than others?
I mean, I think there are definitely limits. We're speaking in English for a start, so yeah, academia generally is very Anglocentric. So I think that's a legacy that is going to be difficult to overcome. Yes, I mean, I think there are certain aspects of history that sort of lend themselves to this more sort of critical approach. But I think just to sort of as a general understanding about the past, I think decolonization does have important. It's important for like all sort of historians practicing to understand even like the colonial framework or the imperial framework of their own discipline. The fact that it is rooted in a very specific moment. Like, so the origins of history are rooted in this very specific sort of late 19th century moment, which was also in Europe, which was also the moment of the high period of European imperialism.
When we've done this interview with several other academics as well, and one of the questions that we found most interesting to ask concerning their research is just how it has changed within the context of COVID. Because within history, there's a large emphasis on accessing primary resources, and a lot of that comes with archival work, and most of that being only available in a hard copy. So I was wondering how that has affected your work specifically, how not being able to access archives, not being able to go to the libraries in firsthand has affected the way you conduct your research.
Yes, absolutely. COVID has been devastating for any type of archival research. Clearly, we have not been able to do it, and that has affected my research plan. So I have like one research project, one sort of research, sort of a big folder of things that I want to do actually, but they're all post-COVID because there's no way that I can do any of those things without going to the archive. So it has meant that I've had to adapt some of my ideas and the projects that I'm going to do. There is actually quite a lot of digitally available material, which we have to just make the most of. So, for example, I talked to you before about my interest in sort of international organizations. Very conveniently, organizations like the United Nations and others, or UNESCO, those kind of associated agencies have a lot of digitized material. WHO, for example, and if it's not digitized, they're willing to digitize it for you. So it does shape the way that you conduct. I mean, it has shaped the way that you conduct your research, and yeah, there's no getting around the fact that you can't get into an archive, and especially if your interests are, you know, in a geographical area that is a long way from where you are. That is, you know, even worse. Like the prospects of you know, for me, getting to an Indian archive anytime soon are yeah, they're not great. You know, for Scottish historians who are based in Scotland, then perhaps there's a hope that they might be able to get to an archive this summer. But yeah, so it has shaped the way that the sort of projects that I'm thinking of, that I'm working on. But I think there's another set of factors as well that are important to talk about. So it's very uneven. So the way that academics work is they spend a lot of time, you know, in their summers when they're not teaching. That's when they do their research, you know, in the sort of non-teaching bits of the year. That's when they really get down to their research. And I think for parents and people that have, you know, had other caring responsibilities during this time when there's been no formal childcare available, there's been homeschooling. I think, yeah, this has really affected academics having to work under those conditions as well. So, you know, some people have been incredibly productive in this period if they haven't had other, if they've already collected their research and they haven't had other commitments, then they have actually been able to be productive in this period, whereas others have not. So that's kind of all quite disproportionate. A fairly complex picture, I think.
And with this in mind, do you feel that there is now a larger encouragement for archives or institutions with these archives to digitize their sources, if for historians that look at like certain documents and like paper sources?
Yes, I mean, I think this was happening anyway. You know, the sort of digitization of archives is something that's been happening along with the digitization of books. But you know, there's so much archive material that, you know, has not been digitized and maybe never will be. And also, you can't. Nothing replaces the digging around in an archive, to spend time in the archive, finding, sort of following the trails. Nothing replaces that. And, you know, when people start digitizing material, they put it in collections, they start organizing it, you know, perhaps in different ways, and then that affects what you can find out. There are issues around like text searching, like text searchability. That's quite, you know, using terms to search is, you know, a different process from sort of doing things in a sort of more analog, kind of hands-on, physical way. So there's issues around the sort of digitization of archives that, you know, we need to think about.
And I think that's a final question, because I mean, questions we ask you is like questions regarding you as an academic. But on top of that, you're also an educator in terms of your time during university period as you teach students. And I was wondering, as a more of a lighthearted question to end the interviews, to ask like what aspects you find most enjoyable about teaching when you are during the university period.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I love teaching, and, you know, I find it extremely inspiring. It's a two-way thing, you know, teaching. So what I bring to it is, you know, my knowledge and expertise, but, you know, I get back from the students their own perspectives, you know, their own thoughts. You know, being a student, engaging with all of this stuff is a creative exercise. So I get that back, you know, and I get to kind of engage with these kind of ideas, which I think is probably the best bit of the job. So, you know, I feel really lucky, feel really privileged to be able to teach and, you know, sort of be exposed to all of that. So yeah, that's I think that's probably the best part of being an educator for me.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Parr, for coming onto our show and allowing us to have this interview with you. I realize we're a bit heading on to the end of the hour, so we'd just like to end the interview here. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been a privilege having you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much. And for those listening, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week for another episode. Thank you so much. Bye bye.